Hey there, thanks for tuning into Duckbricks. I'm Chris, and just recently I got a chance to acquire a prototype LEGO Bionicle set, the likes of which rarely ever escape LEGO headquarters, and this one I was only able to get because it was shown off at a toy fair and somehow never sent back to LEGO. Now the thumbnail already has given away what the set is, but here's a hint, it's hanging above my head right now. That's right, this is the actual Axalara T9 LEGO set introduced in 2008 as part of the Bionicle Battle Vehicles line, and this is the prototype Axalara T9 showcased at the Toy Fair in 2008, featuring fully 3D printed pieces for all the new pieces introduced in the set, from the panels on the side, to the silver fins, to the front armor, and yes, the dual mask combo for Fantoka Liwa Nuva there. And while these sets may look basically identical, especially from a distance, there are some very interesting key differences in, of course, the way the parts are produced, but also in the entire shaping of the mask itself that we're going to highlight in this video. And so, let's blast off and take a look at this prototype LEGO set, which I was able to acquire from Skybird. Go check them out because he's one of the most talented LEGO Bionicle builders out there, builds a lot of Rocky, known for building Rocky in fact, and so he was able to pick this up when it was randomly listed for sale. I have no idea how it went from the Toy Fair basically almost like 10 years ago up until now to randomly being sold online, which he was able to snap up and then sell back to me. But thank you, Skybird, for selling me this. I cannot believe I'm holding a prototype Bionicle set in my hands. I never thought I would own one, and let's jump into this right now. So this right here is the prototype Axalara T9. Showcased at the 2008 Toy Fair, this is a Bionicle model that is using primarily just existing Bionicle pieces, with a few major exceptions, namely the pieces that were created for this set. Those would be the red Technic panels here, of which there are several covering the front of the ship, the mask and wing combo for Liwa Nuva there in the adaptive form, as well as the front silver fins, plus the armor piece used for the front of the ship itself. Otherwise, everything else here is pretty much just using standard Bionicle pieces. There have been little pieces of tack or somewhat sticky material meant to signify to whoever was manning the Toy Fair booth which knobs to twist when displaying this model to customers, and overall, this is probably one of the most interesting items I will ever own in my collection. Once again, major thank you to Skybird for being willing to sell this to me, for even finding it in the first place on some random listing and being able to get it. That was such a crazy story, and this is such a cool model to now own in my collection. Now, obviously for this video, I do want to focus in on the prototype pieces themselves, because I feel like those are going to be the most interesting things to look at. Any Bionicle fan who owns or is aware of the Axalara T9 knows basically how it functions. You've got the landing gear here, which works basically the same as the actual set, a little bit squeaky because this model is a little dustier than what I'm used to. You have the claw piece here, which kind of open and closed, also super similar to the way the actual set works. Again, the build is basically identical to the real thing, and I have actually brought alongside the real thing later on in this video to do a direct comparison. And then of course the figure itself is pretty much exactly what you would expect, except for the fact that he has a brand new mask, and if you look very closely, it is actually a completely different molded shape and a completely different form of the shape than the actual mask that we eventually would get in the final set. Now, this model is really interesting because it gives us a little bit of a peek behind what it feels like to develop an actual LEGO set with prototype elements. If I actually go ahead and try to really remove this piece here, actually, you know what, I don't know. Okay, there we go. Ooh, that was a little bit scary. I don't know if I want to do that again. But here you can see, this is what it looks like to have a 3D printed LEGO element. This is actually specifically done by LEGO's in-house 3D printers. At least I know nowadays they have in-house ones. Back in 2008, they might have outsourced it to a vendor, but this looks so cool, and you can clearly tell that everything was initially printed in white, and then they were later spray painted or painted red, silver, and so on, especially because, as you can see, it wasn't quite fully painted here, where you can see just some bits and pieces of the actual white material shining through. I will not be daring to remove this piece. I can tell that some of the prototype elements are a little bit more fragile than actual LEGO pieces and sets. That was even more than what I'm willing to do for a prototype model, but you can see that it is basically, for this piece, just identical to what we would eventually get, just with a very interesting texture. It does not feel like a Lego piece. It feels like something you would get off of Shapeways with a very grainy texture, because it is, of course, the way that these pieces were manufactured is pretty much the same way that Shapeways makes things if you pay for basically their cheapest options. So that's what that looks like, which is really, really cool. I'm going to stick that back on the front there. Now, the panels, as we learned in the Secret Life of Lego Bricks book, were actually specifically made for Bionicle. While we typically now associate these panels with Lego Technic and so on, these pieces were literally made just for the Axalara T9, Rocco T3, and whatnot, because they were specifically done to actually have a smooth covering for the sides of the Bionicle vehicles and make them feel a little bit more realistic in the way that they were done, which is really cool just how big of an influence Bionicle had on Technic's look and feel going forwards. Obviously, these panels are still in production today, and we have so many more shapes and sizes of the panels, and it feels really cool to literally own a piece of Lego history, which is the very first set that these panels actually came in, and you can see the development process when making the panels themselves. Now, this is really, really interesting because, again, it is so strange for a piece of prototype Lego material to ever escape the factories and to ever escape the design offices. Pretty rare that you would see something like this. I don't feel like any prototype set really goes out there that often, so it is very, very special to actually get my hands on this in my collection. But now I think we should focus in on the moment that a lot of people are probably very curious about, and that is the mask itself. Now, I'm going to very carefully remove the mask so we can do some comparisons with the actual thing, and to do that, I've actually brought alongside my own copy of the Axalara T9. You know what, we'll put the mask back on just so we can do a bit of a side-by-side comparison here, but this right here is, as you can see, the prototype set just on that side of the screen. And as I'm bringing it over, we also have the official set itself. There are literally no differences in the build itself. They are basically identical things. One of them is a prototype, and one of them isn't. And this is kind of what that looks like. They are barely fitting in my review studio, but you can probably already start to see some pretty major differences in the mask itself, specifically in the shape of the eyes, in the way that the centerpieces work, even in the fins, and that is probably one of the most interesting aspects of the model to me. Otherwise, pretty much there's not really a comparison to be held here because the two sets are practically identical. These are basically the same exact build, using the same exact pieces, except some of them are prototypes, which is very cool. One thing I do want to note that I find funny about the prototype model is that there's a little bit of paint on the edges of the white cones here, because these are probably rubbing off of it in transit and they cause some paint to get scratched onto the cones. It just makes it feel a little bit more worn, like there's a story behind it, and I really like that. I feel like there is a story behind this particular model, and now it's just so much more interesting to own, and you can really see the journey that this model has taken over the years. I have no idea how it went from a toy fair to being sold randomly online and going from there, but you know what? Very, very cool that they did that. And now let's go ahead and compare the two masks. So for the masks themselves, I really wanted to do a side-by-side comparison because it is very interesting just how much the masks actually changed from one to another. And it honestly kind of makes me wonder what other things may have changed in the development of Bionicle sets that we just aren't aware of in terms of very, very minute differences to the masks themselves. What I will start off with is I'll keep the two pieces attached, and then we can move on to separating them out so we can see the differences there. The first thing that you will probably notice is that the eye holes of the prototype mask are just much larger than the actual thing. The center hole is also fully hollow, so you can actually see through to there. I think that would have been really cool to see. It's almost like a target reticule there, but I understand why they didn't do that, because maybe that just made it a little bit less stable. As we move upwards to the top of the mask, you have some pretty drastic shaping differences on the top, whereas the final mask has a much narrower slit on the top here, and it has this actual pattern that kind of forks inwards into the back of the mask, whereas the prototype just has these two spikes going like this, and it looks a little bit closer to the standard Liwa Fantoka mask, which is really interesting. These are also a lot more angular. It is pretty rounded off here and kind of almost rectangular squared off on the final mask, but then these are very, very sharp and angular for the prototype. And then, as you move on to the side here, you may notice that they actually added this little bit of a hole on the side of the final mask, which was not there on the initial mask, even though most of the other details are preserved. One thing you will notice is that the molding slot on the actual molded mask is not present on the 3D printed one, which makes sense because they really didn't need to necessarily have a molding piece injected for that. I kind of like it because it looks like a mouth, but it is very interesting to see what the mask looks like without, because I feel like that does drastically change the way the mask actually looks. Moving on to the back, there isn't much to see with the actual visor piece in. It's clear that they always wanted this to be transparent, but obviously you can't make a solid white color 3D printed piece transparent, so they went with the next best thing, which was kind of this milky blue color, but I'm going to very gently remove that here. Again, really want to be super careful with these pieces because I do not want them to break. And we can start off by looking at the comparison between these two pieces here, which actually are a little bit different from each other, which is very interesting. Now, one thing you might notice is that the prototype version has this kind of notch cut out of the back right here, which is quite interesting. So you can see that the final version has this very solidly covered up version here, but then this one has an actual cutout, which is quite interesting. So you can see that. You also have a little bit more refinement on the final model for the detail on the wings themselves, whereas the initial one not only had the wings be pretty much plain, but they were a lot thinner. And you may notice that with the 3D print, it's actually a little bit damaged because this piece right here is peeling up a little bit, which is why I really want to be careful because I do not want to break a prototype Lego piece, but we're going to be very, very gentle with this. Moving onwards to the back, that's what this looks like right here. Again, a little bit of a different geometry here, which for the die-hard Bionicle fans, this is the most interesting thing possible, right? Like, folks in the comments, you know just how cool it is to actually have a prototype 3D printed Bionicle piece in hand. Like, this is so interesting how different they are, but also how similar they are from each other. And you can see what that looks like right there. I feel like the shape of the eyes, or the visor eyes, so to speak, are pretty similar. Like, they're pretty close to each other. So that basically feels the same, bit more of a different detailing on the front here, but super interesting to see that. What is more interesting to me, though, are the differences between these two masks here, where, as you can see, they're actually pretty different. We covered a lot of the differences already when we took a look at the masks with the actual pieces on, but you can see just how different in profile they are. This one feels more vertical. It almost feels more aggressive. Like, this one feels angrier and more maybe monstrous to me, whereas this one feels more like a standard helmet, or maybe something that you would see like a fighter pilot jet wear, where you'd see like kind of the eye holes here versus this very angular and aggressive looking eye hole. I'm not really sure which one I like more, but it is interesting seeing the differences. Now, moving onwards to the back here, you'll notice that this was a lot thinner in the way that they were handling these pieces, and they're a little bit fragile, like they bend a little bit here, so I just want to be very careful with that. But those were just basically to accommodate the way that the piece was done, and you can see for the final one, they actually refined the geometry from being just rectangles to this more interesting shape on the final mask there. And looking top down, it is a pretty different mask top down because the hole shapes on the top are very different. And it's clear that this is just a very early version of this, where the axle is a lot longer as well. Although I'm not 100% sure if they just made the axle longer on the prototype one to allow it to definitively fit into the head of a Bionicle character without any sort of wiggling. So I can definitely see why they might have done that, but it is still really interesting to see. And one thing I do also want to note that I found quite funny is that they literally put a little piece of tack inside the head of the prototype figure, where you can see right in there, they have just a small piece of glue or tack there. It kind of looks like gum or something like that, to just make it such that the mask would fit in better. I find it funny how they did that, because when I actually 3D print my own masks, sometimes I find myself having to do basically the same exact thing to make sure the masks stay in, so it's cool that LEGO themselves were doing that. And just for fun, I'm going to see what this looks like with the prototype element slotted into the final mask. So that's what that looks like there. Interesting. So it's kind of cool. You can see like a solid blue version with thinner wings. That's what that would have looked like there. So very interesting to see something like that. And then we're going to take the final visor piece here, slide it on in to the prototype model. So that's what that looks like there. And you can see this is what that very aggressive eye stance looks like with the transparent blue shining through even the center circle, which I think is really cool. I love that they did that, and it's a very nice touch that they made this actually have that much more interesting detail. I'd be really curious. I mean, maybe it's not worth 3D modeling because the differences are so minute, but if any Bionicle 3D modelers see this video and want to model this piece, do let me know, because that would be really cool to link it in the description and say like, hey, if you want to own this version of the mask, you can download the model and print it yourself. So I'm curious if anyone will try their hand at 3D printing that. But now let's put things back to the way that they belong. So we're going to get the actual piece with the actual mask there, slide that back on. I'm going to take these two components and very, very gently, very carefully slide this back on again. Do not want to deal any damage to the mask itself. And now I think it's time to wrap up some closing thoughts on the model itself. So this is honestly probably one of the most priceless artifacts I will have in my collection. We definitively know that pretty much only one copy of it actually exists. There are no other prototype Axalara T9s out there in the world, at least that are exactly like this. And again, it is so cool to put it side by side with the actual Lego set and see just how the models are very similar, but also have their own differences here and there, where they each have their own unique kind of idiosyncrasies to them that make this one very unique, especially with the way the mask is done, and have the pieces be fully unique as well. Overall, that basically sums up what I have to say about this. This is, again, something that I will treasure for the rest of my life. I plan to open a Lego museum one day, and having an actual prototype in there would be so, so cool. So again, incredibly grateful to Skybird for being willing to sell me this. Thank you so, so much, and for a really great deal as well. I mean, this was a really, really fantastic joy to put together and to review. I mean, not really much to put together, but a joy to actually have the parts in hand to be able to showcase and share with all of you Bionicle fans. Hopefully you found this video interesting, and definitely stay tuned for even more. Thank you again to Skybird, and this is so, so cool. Alright, with that we've summed up our look at the prototype Axalara T9, certainly one of the most interesting LEGO Bionicle items I've had the pleasure of reviewing. Really happy to have been able to document this for everybody interested in Bionicle prototypes, and also just interested in the production process LEGO uses to create new pieces. They were doing fully 3D printed pieces as far back as then, and even before that, so it was really cool to see these actually being shown off as 3D printed. I hope you enjoyed our look at the prototype Axalara T9, and let me know down in the comments, what do you think of the model, and what do you think of the changes to the mask in particular? Do you like the one we eventually got, or would you rather we got the prototype version? Because I definitely feel like there are design attributes like the actual circle for the target reticule in the center being hollow and the eyes being more angular that I kind of wish were featured in the actual set itself. Overall though, hope you enjoyed this look at a very special Bionicle item. Thanks so much for watching, and be sure to like and subscribe for even more LEGO news, reviews, discussion, and analyses coming your way very soon. Thanks, and bye for now.